All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and hope everyone is having a wonderful Wednesday and Wednesday evening. As you all know, my name is Hayden Ron, and I serve as the Director of Chapter Development and Growth for Delta Upsilon Headquarters staff. Before we jump in and I introduce both Dr. Ashley Canty and Zach Thomas, our hosts of our webinar on diversity, equity, and inclusion in fraternity recruitment, just a few kind of logistical pieces. As a reminder, if you could please change your name to include your chapter, so that's easier for us to take attendance, that would be much appreciated. As well as please utilize the Q&A box for any questions you may have throughout the webinar for Ashley and Zach, as well as the chat box for any comments or any responses that may be asked during tonight's presentation. So with that being said, I'm incredibly excited to welcome two just very wonderful and knowledgeable individuals tonight to host our third of 5 Amplify DU webinars. Tonight we have Dr. Ashley Canty and Zach Thomas. Ashley and Zach are co-founders of A to Z Consulting, which is a group of practitioners who provide engaging and thought-provoking experiences in service to clients. The services are concentrated primarily in diversity, equity, and inclusion in learning and development for organizations. A to Z consultants play a critical role in assisting organizations in creating and maintaining a culture of inclusion where all facets of diversity and equity are leveraged to achieve optimum results. A little bit more about Dr. Canty and Zach. Zach Thomas currently serves as the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Prior to working in the corporate sector, Zach has over 15 years of DEI experience working in staff and management positions for nonprofit and private organizations. He also spent a number of years in higher education. Zach is often called on to take over the most challenging areas and troubled project and is recognized for always delivering quick turnaround results for team success. Zach received both his master's and bachelor's from the University of Southern Mississippi. Zach is active in leadership roles with community and civic organizations, including serving as the director for the National Black Greek Leadership Conference with the Association of Fraternal Leaders and Values. Along with Zach, of course, is other co-founder, Dr. Ashley Canty. She serves as the Inclusion Program Manager in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at Wake Forest University. She completed her PhD in Curriculum Studies at DePaul University. Her dissertation research focuses on the experiences of Black sorority women's experience with racism and sexism at predominantly white institutions. She received her master's in college student personnel from Western Illinois University and her bachelor's in biological studies from North Carolina State University. Her previous experience includes working in higher education and with national fraternities in conduct, educational programming, assessment, and diversity and inclusion. Ashley is passionate about creating belonging and shared spaces and understanding intersecting identities to create inclusive environments. Amplify DU participants, please help me in welcoming Ashley and Zach. Ashley and Zach, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. We're so excited to be here tonight, but we know that this wouldn't be possible without Michelle and Hayden. And so we really appreciate not only the work you did to get us to this point this evening, but also the work you do and how much you dedicate to Delta Upsilon. So we certainly appreciate you. So tonight we're going to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in fraternity recruitment. This presentation is interactive. You all have received a handout that includes a lot of our links and the information. So there shouldn't be too many additional notes that you need to take, as we made sure most of the pertinent information you need tonight is on that handout. However, if there's things that you need, information that you'd like to have, don't hesitate to put a question in the chat. We'll make sure that we get to those probably towards the end, but we will get to those. We'll get to them as much as we can throughout the presentation. So let's get started. So as a result of attending this webinar, you'll gain an understanding about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging from a fraternity recruitment lens. You'll also recognize bias within your chapter in the recruitment process. We'll work to define leadership behaviors that are consistent with inclusive leadership and inclusive excellence within fraternity recruitment. And you'll be able to develop 3 strategies to remove bias from your recruitment process. It's always really important to think about where we're starting so that we know where we are going. Another important part of this webinar is that we really want to come from a very strong foundation of what it means to have diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Valuing inclusion, diversity, and equity are essential in creating environments that foster a sense of belonging for all members. So as we talk tonight, I want you to keep these definitions in mind, and these are listed on your handout. Diversity refers to the characteristics that make people unique. It's who we are, it's our identity, it's all of the ways that we show up, and some of the ways that we may not show up based on where we are, who we're interacting with. Equity refers to the fair and respectful treatment for all people. So that means we're not just giving out pairs of shoes, we're giving out pairs of shoes that fit. Inclusion refers to the behaviors and cultural norms that make people feel welcomed. So it's not so much who's at the table, but it's who has voice and how do we recognize that. And belonging refers to an individual and collective sense of acceptance into a group of community. Our organizations are built on the idea that we need them to come together and build community, essentially creating a sense of belonging amongst all. I really think it's important that as we think about your roles as recruitment leaders, that you see yourself as someone who's a change agent within your chapter. You have the ability to really impact what does your chapter look like? Who are you? Who will you be? And how will your campus perceive you? So diversity conscious leadership is what we want to work towards. It's the process by which people influence and empower others by recognizing, understanding, and adjusting to diversity in all its forms. When I've worked in higher education, specifically with fraternities and sororities, the recruitment chairs and the recruitment team were some of the most charismatic people that I met. They are the people that are at the forefront of the organization. They're planning events, they're reaching out to others. And so they have the greatest opportunity to not only be inclusive, but to have the type of leadership style where diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging are at the forefront. Now we're going to do an activity and we're going to do this through Mentimeter. You should have the Mentimeter code on your handout, but I'd like you to take a few seconds and share with us, how would your chapter be described if they were the gold standard of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? What would people be saying? What would they be doing? How would you all be described? I've put the code in the chat so that you can begin using this. You can do this from your phone or from your laptops. You can submit as many times as you want. Okay, we would be diverse and changed. Okay, different members, we'd have a different environment. Everyone feels at home in their chapter and that their identity is recognized and celebrated. Absolutely, really honoring how people show up in the important parts of who they are within the organization, being well respected by others, setting those standards within your community. Open, we would think about different identities and different people. Everyone feels accepted and comfortable. People feel good. Very diverse brothers from all over the country, different ethnic backgrounds, all of the different ways that identity shows up. People would not feel that they don't fit in. Being included regardless of diversity and beliefs. Welcoming and comfortable, the same. So some of you feel that you've already done that work. Anyone accept all. Brothers are respected for who they are. Intentional, exactly. Making decisions that lead towards diversity and inclusion. Intentional about how you and where you recruit students. Open and you don't feel like they have to hide or change who they are. Absolutely. When we create that sense of belonging, people feel safe. There's a level of safety that happens when we create diverse chapters that provide the opportunities for people to show up exactly as who they are. Boundless, but bound by the values. How our values are lived is very important. How are we inclusive? Being accepting to all, everyone has a place. Brothers are respected. I see a lot around respect and brotherhood and values, and those are so important, especially in your roles as you work to create an inclusive environment. Thank you all so much for sharing. When we think about who we are and creating belonging, we also have to think about the individual, which many of you mentioned, how people show up as themselves, feeling that they have a space, feeling proud of who they are. So we're more than just one aspect of our identity. How we show up may be obvious to some, but there's other layers to that. Race, sexuality, gender, social class, religion, culture, ethnicity, and our lived experiences are a part of who we are and make up our complete identity. How we experience life is based on the combination of all of our identities. So as an African-American woman, I don't just experience life from just those two identities. While those are often the most obvious, there's other parts of who I am that impact the way that I experience my life. And by understanding my own identity and all of it, it helps me to develop my own perspective of the world and perception. It also helps us to better understand the experiences that others are having in our chapters. Oftentimes, when we're a part of the majority, our experiences are made the normative. And when people speak against that in ways that maybe shows that we're not as inclusive as we'd like to be, we often silence them and dismiss their experiences, which often creates an environment that is not welcoming and is not conducive to belonging. As we think about our multiple identity development model, I want you to think about which areas are you more aware of? Which areas are you least aware of? Where do you experience privilege? Where do you experience marginalization in those identities? Those are all really important in thinking about how we create more inclusive environments. This program is a lot about inclusion, but a part of that means that we have to also recognize bias. So what is bias? It's the tendency or inclination or disappropriate weight in favor or against an idea. So bias can come up in two places: in-group bias, perceiving people who are similar to you more positively. We can trust them. Their hometown is near mine. They went to my high school. I know some relative or some friend. They're a friend of a friend. Or out-group, perceiving people who are different from you more negatively. They went to a different high school. Look where they grew up. Maybe there's some differences there that you're placing unfair weight on. Bias can be innate or learned. Some things we learn just based on our environments and how we grew up and things that we've experienced. And some things are innate. They're just deeply ingrained, unintentional, but all of these can influence behavior and are often based upon stereotypes. There can be conscious explicit bias or unconscious bias, and unconscious biases can be changed. And most importantly, we all hold bias. But as we work to be more inclusive, it's really important to not only better understand ourselves to challenge those, but to find ways to hold others accountable. We're going to go to Mentimeter, which is a great tool, and I want you all to think about bias in the sense of where have you experienced it most? And you'll see the questions. So in which area of identity have you struggled with bias the most towards you? I'll drop this link in the chat. And this is anonymous. No one knows who shares what. I can't see who shares what, but I'd love for you to share and say, where have you struggled with bias the most towards you? Okay. Language and ability. Those two are very important. Ability definitely comes up when we think about the recruitment process, when we think about our houses, but when we just think about the materials and resources that we have, and just generally not being conscious of there's different ways that people have ability. sexual orientation. That is very important, especially in fraternities, as we think about how some things can be very heteronormative in our policies and the ways that we do things, and just generally the notion of men's organizations and homophobia. Religion and ethnicity, those are often not some that are on the forefront, but can often be challenging when it comes to bias. As people begin to share who they are, people can be targeted for those things. Height, definitely under sexual orientation again. Okay, how happy and joyful, so attitude and socialization. Age and position, mental health, body image, economic background. Religion and socioeconomic status, the ability to talk to people. All of these are many ways that we identify and hold close to who we are. And it's really important to really think about what it means when we are biased towards others, or when how we feel when we experience that, and what that means in our own roles as leaders. Mental health, appearance, ethnicity, and socioeconomic background. And we see the socioeconomic background a lot because these are organizations where there is a certain amount of financial responsibility or needs, and some that go beyond what we're often transparent about. And that's really important to remember the resources that people have, but also the ways that the chapter can support others. Economic background. Okay, switching from this one, let's talk a little bit about the areas of identity that we've struggled with bias the most towards others. As we know, we all have bias, but how have we struggled with it towards others the most? It's the same Mentimeter code, but now the answers will pop up here as we've switched slides. Ability and ethnicity. Race and socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, ethnicity, creed. Gender and sexual orientation. Socioeconomic background, political affiliation. And as you see, there's a lot of similarities in our answers. And as we know that we all hold bias, one of the important parts is for us to educate ourselves and challenge ourselves on what that means. How does that impact the experience? How does that impact the brothers in our chapter? Physical appearance, too extroverted, political ideology. Race, ethnicity. Appearance. Thank you all for sharing. We'll get. On this slide, you'll see that there are a few options, and you all did a really great job of thinking about other ways that people identify, and that's really important and really understanding. Sometimes our biases present themselves as microaggressions. Everyday verbal and nonverbal and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons based solely upon their marginalized group membership. So I often explain microaggressions as a paper cut. You get one paper cut, it doesn't really bother you. But if you go wash your hands, or you use hand sanitizer, or you cut it again, that paper cut just keeps getting hit and hit and hit until now it's a full-blown cut. And so that's what microaggressions are like. This slide shows a few examples that could come up as we think about membership and we're meeting different people. And it's really important to think about the impact that these have. These can often create hostile environments that aren't welcoming, that aren't belonging. They can give senses of hostility and just meanness that we may or may not intend, but it happens, and we have to honor what that means and really work to create change around that. There's a lot of impacts of bias and microaggressions. And as you all answered about things that are happening and how you experience it, it wouldn't surprise me if some of you have experienced some of these things. Thinking about performance and mental health, people become disengaged. Think about members in your chapter that may not be as engaged. They may induce imposter syndrome, like they don't belong. And the stereotype threat of constantly validating a stereotype and working to get so far away from that that you lose a sense of who you are, feeling excluded and alienated. Those are all the ways in which microaggressions and bias can impact the people in our organizations. More importantly, it can also create an environment where people don't feel that they belong, that they don't feel that they're welcome, and that while maybe you're diverse, you may not be inclusive. As we think about overcoming bias, we want to think about 3 different ways that this happens. 1, we have to develop an honest awareness of our own biases, prejudices, and stereotypes. So as you think about the ways that you perpetuate bias, it's really important to think about, how do I have an awareness of this so that I'm able to learn? Think about our organization interventions. We need to align our policies with practice. If you say that you are inclusive, do your policies say that? Are they aligned with inclusive practices? How are we creating accountability? What trainings are in place to address bias? What resources are there for members? And what transparency do we have in the recruitment process? As we think about these organizations, how transparent are we about who we are, what we do, the cost to join, and really selling an experience that is true to who we are, and also owning the areas that we need to do better in? And then thinking about a societal cultural intervention, thinking about the trainings and programs to uncover areas of equity within your organization. Attending this is an organizational intervention. It's a societal and cultural intervention. And what institutional and organization resources do we have? What's available at your institution? What's available from Delta Upsilon? As you all sit through this is a program that is offered. And as you continue through this program, those are ways to really think about, how do we strengthen our chapter to be more inclusive? How do we amplify voices that are often silenced? And how do we look at our policies and procedures and the information we share, and we ensure that there's a degree of transparency so people know exactly who we are and where we have room, where we have opportunity for change, and share that.
So now that we've talked a little bit about who we are, our intersectionalities, as well as things that we struggle or see within the recruitment process, such as biases and as well as microaggressions, let's talk about, how do we make a community or create a community that is filled with inclusion, filled with a sense of belonging. As you all think about your own experiences within DU, what makes you feel like you belong or feel included? So if you can use the chat feature, what makes you feel included within DU? What makes you feel a sense of belonging? So use the chat feature. Kind of tell me a little bit about how you feel with that. Inclusivity. Okay. Memories and the values. Yes. We're going to talk a little bit about those values. Any others? Well, you can keep those going, but I really like this quote here where it says, belonging is a feeling and therefore a far more powerful force than any DEI strategy could ever be. It's a fundamental human need, a word that translates across any language or culture, and a feeling that every human is wired to want. So we want to feel that sense of belonging. And belonging gives people a sense of community, connecting to something. It brings people together across all backgrounds, and has a sense of mutual respect and a community of learning. It creates access and resources for people who need it the most. So not everyone has brothers and sisters. And so being a part of an organization such as DU gives them access to brothers and sisters and or individuals they might see as potential siblings. It's engaging with other campus organizations to a broader reach of networking. But then also it access the needs of the community. How are you equitable in building networks and providing other resources? Next slide. So when you're thinking about the quality of the membership selection, character should be at the foundation as you all are going through the recruitment process. Some things to think about as far as organizational expectations. What qualities are we looking for during the membership selection? Are we going to our true core values that we stand for? Brotherhood, service, scholarship. Are those the things that we're looking for? And do we want our members to have those? What questions do we ask our potential new members when we meet them? Are we just asking, oh, what do you like to party? But are we asking, what's your favorite book? What is the latest TED Talk that you heard, or understanding and get to know who they are at the sense and the core. As Ashley mentioned before, there are so many different intersectionalities to who we are as individuals that are not just physical. So getting to know people and having those questions are important. What can your organization offer that no other organization can? How are you relaying that to potential new members? Are you saying that we are an organization that about scholarship service, that we're going to soup kitchens, that we are donating to scholarships, that we're doing this? And so making sure that people know who you are as an organization. How does your organization create a sense of belonging? Are you telling those stories during the recruitment process? Or not using and quote unquote, the only person who might be of color in the group to tell the story? Have everybody tell their story. How are they feeling a sense of belonging? We don't like to be tokenized and have people feel like tokens, but how do you feel like a sense of belonging within your organization? How is that coming up? And so tell those stories so that you can recruit more people within your organization that have the same kind of values and beliefs. And how does the chapter engage inclusivity? Are you participating in several programs, resource networks? Are you partnering with your multicultural affairs office or your diversity and inclusion office to do programs within your chapter as well as for the campus community? These are things to think about that as you're looking to do recruitment and recruit a diverse population, that you can branch out to other stakeholders to have those kind of educational opportunities. Also, as you all begin to do and think about recruitment, think of it from a leadership aspect and what we like to call inclusive leaders. And so inclusive leaders are committed to several different things. One, they're committed to valuing diversity, equity, and inclusion in practice. It's not something that is just for show, but it's something that you practice it. As you all know, after recent incidents last summer, individuals came out with broad statements from their national offices. But then behind that, there was some action. So a statement without the action is just fluff. What are you doing to practice DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and belonging? How are we empowering others to create change within equity work? Are you asking your members to be a part of other organizations which could help with recruitment, where they're meeting other people other than the ones that are in their own niche or their own group outside of their group? So how are you practicing that? What are some professional and personal growth that you are looking to have? Are you writing your own strategic plan about diversity, equity, and inclusion within your organization as well? And then finally, Inclusive Leaders is committed to keeping awareness, practice, and resources aligned with systemic support of diversity, inclusion, and belonging. Are we educating ourselves? Are we reading the necessary books? Are we going to the necessary programs? Are we partnering with other fraternities or sororities on our campus to make sure that we look like an inclusive and diverse organization that believes in this? So what I want to do is kind of talk through some of these questions that I have and using the chat feature. The first question is, how would you, as leaders, which you all are, demonstrate support of diversity, equity, and inclusion during the recruitment process? What would that look like? Being receptive to the representation of each individual. Thank you. That's great. Yeah, because we all come from different environments and different backgrounds. And so asking deeper questions about individuals. Yeah, I know oftentimes within recruitment, having worked in fraternity sorority life, some of those questions could be surface level. But what do you get? How are you truly getting to know an individual who could potentially be your brother if you don't go deeper? We already have a diverse brotherhood, so just from a glance, it's clear diversity, but also talking openly about views and openness and acceptance, asking their goals, giving equal attention to each person's input, yes. Asking questions that relate to range and personality. Great, these are great responses. Being open and honest about who we are instead of exaggerating the truth. That's a snap or a clap. Talk about our values and how we emphasize the practice of our values and sharing our feelings. These are great. But what strategies or resources do you have available to you to do some of these things that you say you can do or demonstrate? Because as we think about this, we have to think about our own sphere of influence. Who are some individuals who are around us that could help us, our other stakeholders, as we begin to recruit from a diversity, equitable, and inclusive lens? Collaborate with ethnic clubs, fraternities, and sororities? Yes. Have people get involved in and on campus organizations? Yes, that's great. Are your members involved in other organizations and clubs as active members, not just on the roster? A giant apartment complex next to our house. Yes, going over and meeting individuals who might be over there or hosting things over there with the complex. It's a great recruitment opportunity to meet a diverse audience. The brother himself, the values we uphold is the greatest strategy for diversity and inclusion. Other than that, by proudly exhibiting and existing diversity could welcome for new people, yeah. Practice recruitment conversations with different organizations. That's a great suggestion. That's a great suggestion. And I think in thinking about that, how can you partner with, for instance, another multicultural organization and talk about your process, or an MPHC organization? That way they are learning about your process, but you also are being able to practice some of those skill sets for as recruitment, especially if you're looking to bring in a diverse population. That's a great suggestion. Create social networks that provide other organizations to network with each other. And finally, what strategies and resources do you need for this to be successful and for this to work? Someone said informational tables, events on campus. Resources that could help us would be direct access to the earlier years, as most of our brothers are older now, okay. And the other, what are some of the resources and strategies you need to be successful? Having it be a part of the campus culture. Kappa Alpha Psi and Delta Sigma Theta and DU event. That's great option, or whichever org is available. Then add a larger student organization involved in creating student life. So yeah, so partnering with other stakeholders that are not in the council you're in. General awareness of the chapter. So as you all are thinking about these questions and answering these questions, just know what you just did was created your strategic plan for DEI recruitment. You talked about the support for the process and things that you need. You talked about the strategies and resources that are available to you. And you talked about who you need as stakeholders to help you do that. This is pretty much you writing your strategic plan for recruiting a diverse and equitable membership. Next slide. As you all know, change is not going to come overnight or happen overnight, but then also, as you all are leaders, you know there are some who are going to be resistant to change, saying, but we always done it that way. We always just invited members over and did it this certain way. But there are 4 reasons why people are resistant to change. One is self-interest. They have their own self-interest at mind when they're thinking about this or going through. The next is a lack of trust. They don't trust the process. And so oftentimes I like to use what we back in higher ed, TTP, trust the process. And so you have to have some buy-in and get some buy-in and build trust. They also have different opinions. Not everyone thinks like you, but I am a big component of use every moment as a teachable moment and talk about the benefits of having a diverse, equitable, and inclusive organization that creates a sense of belonging for everyone and how that would look. And then finally, there's a low tolerance to change. Not everybody is happy about change. Knowing that change is a process and a journey, please understand that this is not going to happen overnight. It might not be in this round of recruitment. It could be it could show up 2 years from now, but just know that you are setting some foundation work that could happen for change in the future. And then oftentimes when we have those people who are resistant, we have to be an ally. Allyship has come up a lot this year, over the past year and a half, I would say. But what is allyship? Allyship is making the commitment and effort to recognize that the importance of inclusion within your chapter. What student organizations should you connect with? And we talked about that a little bit. It's also understanding that it is your own interest at the end. All forms of oppression. And it also challenges us to think outside of the box and to get rid of the stereotype. Allyship is not speaking in the place of, but it's also speaking up for. And so understanding that you can't be the spokesperson for all Black people to be an ally, but you can speak up for. Allyship is something that it happens behind closed doors when no one is watching. It's calling out those members who say things that are inappropriate or pulling them out of the recruitment process when incidents of microaggressions and bias show up and educating them on why we don't do that. It's also committing to reducing our own complicity of and conclusion of oppression of groups and invest in the strengthening our own knowledge of our own bias. So educating ourselves continuously about various aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Next slide. So ultimately, you're here to understand, how do we recruit inclusively? And so things that you have already spoken about and mentioned along this presentation or webinar is, one, ask questions. I think somebody mentioned it further. How do we dig deeper in our questions that we ask? Learn about brothers, learn about potential new members beyond the surface level. Ask about their hobbies, books they've read, programs they've attended. Questions that will help you determine if this individual lives up to your values as an organization. Also, be sure to broaden your network, partnering with other organizations that are not within the same council, student organizations to put on programs. As you all know, recruitment is 365 days a year. It's not just that 1, 2, or 3 week period that your organization or your campus might say it's recruitment time. But it's 365 days a year. How are we walking the walk and talking the talk as an organization? People should see our values when we walk around. They should see that we represent brotherhood, scholarship, a diverse and equitable organization. So go into other programs and events on campus in your letters, interacting with different populations and engaging with the campus community, but also connecting with faculty and staff to get recommendations of individuals who they think live up to the GU values. There's nothing wrong with building a relationship with faculty and staff on that level, and inviting them individuals to several events such as bowling, meals, or alumni speeches, or any brotherhood events that are open to the campus population. And then finally, challenging the bias statements in membership selection. What are some of the things, and reviewing our materials to make sure that bias is not showing up in it? Is there a statement that is superficial and rooted in bias? Do we perpetuate a negative group of stereotype? Do we perpetuate the term that I hate, frat boy mentality, but a sense of brotherhood or fraternity men that are about the values of our organization? Next slide. And so our final thought is it's important to become aware of our own bias and to challenge it when they present themselves. I am a big component. We all have biases. And so we have to challenge those biases and continue to educate ourselves on those biases and call ourselves out, as well as others who might have biases that show up. We must continue to educate ourselves on bias and work to challenge recruitment practices that perpetuate a systemic bias. We also need to work to understand the experiences of all our members better and support them so that we know when we're bringing in a diverse membership, we're able to have those resources and support networks that are there. Are we reviewing our pay structure? Because as we know, socioeconomic status is another part of identity. And so if members are not able to pay their dues, are we making some concessions? Are we having some tough conversations about what that looks like? That's a dimension of diversity that we need to understand as well. And then finally, understanding that fraternity recruitment experience can be the best opportunity challenge bias on our campus within the organization and creating a sense of belonging. Individuals join these organizations and they stay in these organizations because the sense of belonging that is there and because what they stand for. And so what you want to do is continue to recruit members who stay in the process, as well as stay within our organizations as active lifelong members. And so with that, what we want to do is kind of come and answer any questions that you all might have. We want to leave enough time for question and answer. So please feel free to use the Q&A box or the chat feature to answer any questions. Ask any questions, sorry. Okay, not all at once. So we have a question. Do you have any recommendations for speakers? I would say looking to partner with like your multicultural affairs office or your diversity and inclusion office to see if there are any upcoming speakers that members could attend, or they might have some suggestions of some, or looking at some of the internal experts on your campus within the faculty and staff ranks that could come and serve as potential speakers on these topics as well could be a good resource. There are a lot of TED Talks that talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's another way if you don't have the finance to bring in a big name speaker. Ashley, do you have any recommendations?
I would say, so I work in our Office of Diversity and Inclusion at Wake Forest. Our Chief Diversity Officer does a lot of speaking, but also just like if there's assistant deans and people on campus that can do that type of speaking. When I think about college speakers, you'd probably have to defer to like AFLV or those different speaker bureaus. As I'm not as familiar with who's kind of the up and coming ones, but that's important to consider. Our next question is, what would you say is a good first or next step for a chapter in their inclusive recruitment planning? For me, I think that is really thinking about what is it that you do now? How well is it working, and what do you need to do better? So like a start, stop, continue. So, and be very honest about that. And when you see some of those things that are either start or stop, start to interrogate the ways that those impact the experience. So for example, if your recruitment, and I know there's a lot of rules with campuses, public, private, NIC, DU rules, so there's a lot of things to consider. But if your recruitment consists of a few nights of like maybe an hour meet and greet, then think about the types of events that work. Think about the types of ways that you help introduce people who are interested to other members. Make sure that there's some type of strategy behind who's talking to who's there. If you start to see that there's so many people that are similar to everyone that's there, then you need to think about how do we broaden our networks. So doing a start, stop, continue exercise with your current process really helps you to identify opportunities for growth and opportunities for change.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
We do have one question in the Q&A that says, what would some good ways to communicate these ideas to the rest of our chapter? And so I would say, as you all are going through the recruitment process, have a recruitment meeting dedicated to this topic, and using some resources or bringing in some of those speakers to kind of talk through what DEI mean. I think you have to start with the foundation of language, making sure we have on the same page with the language and definitions, but then also talking with and having someone come in and communicating why this is important and beneficial to our organization in one of your recruitment meetings or workshops.
Mm-hmm. Diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives fail when the leadership hasn't made a commitment to doing the work. So for example, I know that you all will have some meeting with coaches, and some of the DEI activities really talk about solidifying your commitment to this. Your executive board has to make this a priority. If you all don't make this as a priority for you all as a team, nothing you ever do is going to push through enough to make a difference. And so I would say that's how you start. You make a commitment as a chapter leadership, you communicate that, and then you talk about what are the things that may be different. I think that's also related to our question here that says, how do we create an environment for change, and how do we minimize the resistance? One, the leadership has to make a commitment. Two, you have to get buy-in. You have to talk about the ways that this is beneficial. It's not enough just to say, well, we should be inclusive. Okay, so why? Anytime you want to make a change, just say, like, why? Why is this? What is this? What is the impact? Why is this important? What does this make different? How does this change the experience? If one person in your chapter is experiencing bias on behalf of your chapter, that's enough to fix it. And so you really have to make that commitment to doing it and to owning that you're not going to get it perfect. But if it's saying, okay, once a semester, we're going to have this type of training. And then it goes from, well, not only are we going to have this training, we're going to infuse social justice in our conduct process. And then we're going to infuse transparency in our policies and transparency in the materials we give out at recruitment. even if the information you give out looks different than any other group, you still need to pride yourselves, because in my experience with DU, being a non-secret fraternity means that that should be throughout. There should be transparency and decision-making. There should be transparency and information. Obviously, there are some things that maybe people don't share, you don't share till they get further within the process, but there should still be a degree of transparency that's there. Even within your chapter, to help minimize change. Talk about the decisions you're making. Talk about the workshops you've attended over the past 2 months. Talk about why those workshops are important. Talk about the things you want to do, because that degree of transparency as a leader is what's going to help you carry these things through.
But then also someone mentioned about having the tough conversations in a safe environment. That is extremely important. And so we know that talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion could be emotionally charged to some individuals. And so my thing is create some ground rules, create a gracious space is what I like to say, where individuals feel comfortable and open to have these kind of dialogues. And I think you being vulnerable, whoever's leading the conversation, kind of contributes to individuals having a safe and a respectful conversations around DEI topics.
There's so many resources. Oh, what about chapters that have to recruit in more formal IFC process? How can they create? So what I usually tell chapters that have to do the more formal process is, I've been at institutions where I've seen a formal one and also informal, is you have to recruit people into the process. You know, it's not one of those, if you build it, they will come. You've got to do the building. You've got to build that process. You've got to meet people and say, hey, I think you'd be an awesome fraternity man. Why don't you sign up for fraternity recruitment? We used to call it man flirting, but that's probably the wrong term to use at this point. But years ago when I did this work, that's what it was called. But you really have to make them feel that there's a place for them. And it doesn't mean that it's in your group. Like I said, invite them to fraternity recruitment, but really thinking about how you recruit people into the process, and really being honest about the experience that you're offering, and really showing that through getting them involved in the fraternity recruitment process. I think formal IFC recruitment definitely poses more of a challenge because there's not a lot of things that you can control. But Zach mentioned earlier the sphere of influence. What is it that you can control? You can work with IFC to recruitment into the process. If you all do tabling events or any type of house tours, you can include equity in that. You can think about the ways that you talk about your due structure and payment plans. You can think about the men that show up that on those different nights of rounds, and think about how they really fit into your organization. And you can also be true to what the experiences that you offer, and also the areas where you all may be more challenged and are doing more work.
And this is a great point. Social media plays a huge part in recruitment. How do chapters ensure social media recruitment outreach is inclusive? I think that's, you have to make sure you're, for instance, I know that there is a Heritage Month mostly for every month of the year. What are you doing as an organization to recognize that and publicize that? And not just to be performative allyship, but how are you showing that as an actionable item? Are you attending events based off that Heritage Month and publicizing on your social media? Are you making sure that you're recognizing members within that Heritage Month so they have an opportunity to feel included as well? Ashley, you got some other on social media?
I would say be consistent. Not everything, like share who you are, but also be conscious that social media screenshots live forever. But also be aware and be consistent. If you are celebrating Black History Month, you know, be consistent when that comes to the Black and brown people in your chapter. If you're celebrating Pride Month, but you have a rule that men in your chapter can't bring their partners, if they're male partners, to formals or semi-formals, then you're not being consistent. Be consistent with what you post. And if you know you're still working through that and understanding it, that's fair too. Just make sure that the statements you make are consistent with who you are and the environments that you create. Part of Rush is inherently pairing people with similar ideas, interests, ideas, philosophies to make connections and make them feel comfortable. and as though they were similar people. With this in mind, how do you walk the line between pairing people with similar interests to establish a connection versus profiling them because of certain aspect of their personality or identity? So this happens obviously in recruitment. I mean, it happens in job interviews and anything else. So that means if you already know that there's some very surface similar identity pieces, then that's where you get the deeper questions. They don't need to know what school they went to. They don't need to know where they're from. That's when you can get into those deeper questions. What is your major? Why, not just what is your major, but why did you choose it? What is important to you? What, what is it that you do to, like, what does your self-care look like? Why is joining a fraternity important to you? What is it that you hope to gain from this experience? Here's what we have to offer. You can go more in depth. If I already know that we went to the same high school and we knew each other, I can have a more in-depth conversation about your why. And then they can also ask questions about them. You can train them to do some deeper dives, but then you can also not pair people with similarities as well. You can take two different people from two different walks of life and put them together and see what happens. They could easily find things in common, but it will push the men in your organization to move past very surface level questions if they don't know anything about them, or if they know something about them, they can dig a little deeper.
And what I like to say to that is that individuals like to have what I like to call mirrors and windows. So I like to see individuals that look like me within an organization that has the same interests as me. But then that's your mirror. But I also like to have windows to see through who are other individuals that might not look like me, but have similar interests or something I can learn from. And so how can we pair individuals to have those deeper conversations in that? Because not everybody's looking for somebody just like them.
Well, it is 9:01. So we are going to wrap this up, but thank you all so much for being here, for being engaged. We hope that this information is helpful. As always, you can definitely get our contact information from Michelle and Hayden, and we're more than happy to answer questions or provide any support. The handout is there. You have it. You have so much information there that you're able to use. And hopefully the coaching session that occurs after this gives you a little bit more insight to make that commitment to having an inclusive recruitment. So thank you all so much for being here with us. I hope that everyone is staying cool as they can and hydrated, and enjoys the upcoming long weekend.
Great. Well, Ashley and Zach, thank you so much. That was wonderful, and so much just amazing information for our participants. So I can't thank you enough there. For participants, specifically our main participants, please be on the lookout for a message or an email from your recruitment coach to set up your small group meeting for next week, in which you will be continuing these conversations around DEI, in addition to potential new member referrals, alumni involvement, and a few other topics. All will be really important, obviously, to the program. So again, Ashley and Zach, thank you so much for hosting tonight. And for the rest of you, have a great rest of your Wednesday evening. And for those main participants, have a great small group meeting with your coaches next week.